If you were to look at some of my artwork, you would know that I'm a pretty big fan of the DC superhero Shazam, namely the DCEU film released back in 2019. A film I only became interested in because, well, my mom really likes Zachary Levi and, well, I liked him in Tangled and the trailers actually looked promising. Then the fact that the kid playing Billy Batson was a fellow Asher led to the film becoming one of my most anticipated 2019 releases. When the day came, nearly an early screening for the movie, I saw it with my folks and absolutely loved it. It had a great story, some strong heartwarming themes, a lot of intense scenes whether they were of action and horror, solid performances, and that perfect balance of comic book camp and slower, more moving moments. Not only did it become one of my absolute favorite comic book films, but also one of my favorite films period, even leading to Shazam becoming my favorite non-Batman DC character. With all that said, you could imagine that I would obviously be excited for the sequel when it was announced, and ended up rather disappointed. Not really by the film itself, but how it was received. Where the first film did fairly well box office wise and even better in reviews, the sequel wasn't as lucky, sadly. Being seen as a box office disappointment, it made its budget back, but well, that doesn't stop a movie from being a bomb now, does it? Hell, it actually did worse on digital, managing to do worse than Morbius. Somehow. That and the critical scores were much more lukewarm, with the universal opinion of it being it wasn't as good as the original, which I can somewhat agree with. It is noticeably weaker, but was it really that bad? Well, I'll give my quick review of it. As far as sequels go, I'd say it gets the job mostly done. The characters are still lovable, the themes of found family are still strong, the villains were fun, and there were plenty of moments that got me emotionally invested. As for flaws, well, where the first film had the right balance of Zachary Levi and Asher Angel, Angel here gets sidelined pretty hard. And there's much more of Zach being his usual goofy self, which I can kinda see wearing thin after a while. That, and I feel it got a tad excessive with both its comedy and CG-filled action, and the lack of Billy and Freddy chemistry was noteworthy. So I can agree that this is a really flawed film. Definitely rough around the edges, and noticeably weaker to the original, but does it really deserve the massive backlash it got?
So you have chosen death.
All opinions on these movies are valid, but if someone were to go out of their way and say that this is among the absolute worst, most insulting that the genre has to offer, I'm gonna have to respectfully disagree with them there. I mean, I at least had more fun with this than these two farces. And I still consider this to be among the better of the DCEU films. And I can't be the only one who thinks that given the high audiences scores. Heck, even both general consensus on Rotten Tomatoes seem to suggest that there were still enough good points to make it worth seeing. But alas, it was given a bad hand by both the studio and the DC fan base. But what were the specific culprits to this unfair outcome? Well, let's go over them, shall we? I think I'll start with the first culprit, Zachary Levi himself. Not that he did anything wrong, at least I don't think he did, but he did get into some hot water a while back, namely on Twitter, for expressing his opinion on the vaccine Pfizer, because of course vaccines play a part in it. Basically, everyone started to treat him like the next Chris Pratt, dunking on him for being a quote-unquote Trump supporter and anti-vaxxer when that really wasn't the case. He actually got the vaccine while shooting Shazam 2 and followed the mask protocol on set. His real concern was simply that Pfizer was raising their vaccine price from $100,000 to $300,000 when it was already making plenty of money and only so many companies can make it. Which is a pretty fair point to make. And thankfully, James Gunn isn't the type to drop actors just because of whatever political opinions they have. Shame the same can't be said for those on Twitter, as they dogpiled on Zack and even went as far as claiming they wouldn't see the movie and called him something that he's actually not. But I guess that's Twitter for ya. One minute they like an actor, but as soon as they say something they don't like, no matter what their intentions are or how well they word it, they'll treat you like a goddamn pariah. The other reason I can think of that can be divided into more than one factor is that, well, I felt its release was really bad timing. Firstly, it had some really tough competition, from Creed 3 to John Wick 4 releasing around the exact same time, or even the same weekend, to the Mario movie releasing a few weeks later, which became the movie people wanted to see more than once on the big screen, and not everyone's budget is the biggest. It also came around the time superhero fatigue became more apparent.
I'm tired of this, Grandpa!
That's too damn bad!
Mostly through Marvel's constant spamming of mostly mediocre MCU content that really burnt out fans, along with DC's own inconsistent level of quality, though many argue that it's more of a fatigue of mediocre superhero content, and Shazam 2 sadly got lumped into that pile. My guess is that all the common tropes like the campy humor and CGI fighting might have made critics feel pretty sick of them, which could explain their lukewarm response. Though Guardians 3 and Across the Spider-Verse prove that there is still an intrigue for superhero content as long as the heart and passion is put into them. But if history has taught me anything, especially with DC, is that when a studio manages to make a great film or two after a pretty bad losing streak, it's not a guarantee that they're quote-unquote back, or that level of quality is gonna stick. Need I remind you that the next MCU film after Guardians 3 is The Marvels, which, I'm gonna be frank, I could give two about at this point. But perhaps the biggest example of bad timing for poor Shazam was the announcement of James Gunn rebooting the universe. When WB announced that Gunn would restart the universe with the start of his Superman movie, it made people look at the remaining DCEU films and ask, what's the point? Which certainly played a part in the following bombs for DC Studios. Now, I kinda saw James Gunn's reboot as a double-edged sword. Given how stupid the original plan for the DCEU was, then yeah, I can see how it would be wise to try restarting with a guy who knows how to make a great, effective plan for these characters. Better than Snyder, anyway. But for all the major L's the DCEU had, it did manage to surprise us every now and then, with characters and performances that really struck a chord with tons of people, and gained millions of fans from them. And Zachary Levi's Shazam has arguably been the biggest favorite for many fans. But he just had to be part of a cursed film franchise owned by a cursed studio during perhaps its biggest low point due to a cursed CEO. The downfall of Warner Brothers has depressed me the most in terms of studios that suffered a massive fall from grace. I mean, they gave us the Looney Tunes, DC, Hanna-Barbera, the Turner Networks, various classic movies and TV shows. It's such a key player of our pop culture that has been reduced to a long-running punchline throughout the 21st century. That seems to just get worse with each passing day. And if it's not the studio screwing up the movies, it's half of the actors being pretty terrible people. Whether it's Ezra Miller being an unhinged menace to society, Amber Turd hilariously failing to end this whole man's career, or perhaps the biggest factor to the downfall of the Shazam franchise as we know it, Dwayne Johnson. When it was first announced that The Rock would play Black Adam, it sounded exciting at first. He looked the part and seemed like an inspired choice, that it gave everyone the exciting thought that he and Zachary Levi were bringing one of the most iconic rivalries that DC has to offer to the big screen. Well, The Rock certainly didn't share the enthusiasm.
Can I give you one.
No, thanks.
Please?
No, thanks.
A little one.
Yeah, no, thanks.
Really, it's no secret that Dwayne Johnson might be one of the biggest Hollywood divas this side of Sean Shamel. He turned down appearing in the first Shazam. He insisted Black Adam would get his own movie, and he was against appearing in Shazam 2 as the main villain, and the post-credits scene was originally gonna have characters like Hawkman appear. But guess what? He vetoed that idea too. Remember how he kept saying that the hierarchy of power in the DCU was about to change? Well, what he really meant was that the whole universe was gonna revolve around him, turning into this giant WWE tournament where he wanted to battle Henry Cavill's Superman and never battle the character he's supposed to be arch enemies with. And the studio was too chicken to put him in his place.
I'm terrified of Dwayne Johnson.
He didn't want to be defeated by a hero whose nickname is the Big Red Cheese that's played by a mostly comedic actor. That's lame. And The Rock doesn't want to look lame. So now both films have bombed, the franchise is at risk of rebooting, and now most people see Shazam as a joke now. Thanks for that, Dwayne. Ya diva.
What I believe you were trying to say is thank you.
Regardless of how good he was in the role, the fact that he wasn't a team player made him a terrible casting choice in that regard, and has ultimately soured my opinion on the Black Adam movie, and The Rock as a whole. The Justice Society was cool though. So yeah, there really was a lot going against Shazam's sequel, and the aftermath it left is pretty damn depressing. Months later, and people rarely talk about it, at least not positively, and they keep finding more things to hate about Zack as an actor and keep pushing for his cancellation. But worst of all, no official word about what will happen to the franchise has been announced. David Sandberg said Shazam's future in the DCU will highly depend on the box office and people's reaction to it, which neither have been all that good, so it's really not hard to assume the worst. But despite all that, James Gunn hasn't fully said anything. So until he speaks up about it, Shazam's future is still up in the air. While I have the hot take that the film's flaws weren't that sinful, I do think a course correction would benefit greatly. But if there's some clarity to share, I met a lady running a comic book shop that said that James Gunn is interested in doing something with Zachary Levi's Shazam. He just has to go through this first chapter first. Though, even if that is actually true, and say that Shazam's future does have a sense of certainty, there's still the factor of aging. You see, the whole premise of Shazam is that he's a kid that transforms into an adult superhero, and the kids playing Billy in the gang, they're not gonna be kids forever. Hell, one major plot point of the sequel was that Billy was getting close to turning 18, and leaving foster care was a major fear of his. Not to mention that half of these kids are already in their early 20s. So if we consider aging to be a pretty big problem with continuing this iteration, I really don't know where they can go from here. Well, I do, but again, The Rock screwed them into a corner.
You're welcome.
Maybe there are ways you can continue the story. Maybe even give it a proper, more satisfying send-off. But when's the last time Hollywood made a sequel to a bomb? Then again, the Suicide Squad led to Peacemaker despite bombing, and that didn't even make all of its money back. Though, if they really don't continue Shazam as we know it now, they probably won't do anything with the franchise for a very long time. But as I said, nothing is official until James Gunn makes the announcement himself. Though even Zachary is having doubts about his DC future. Well, to close this off on a lighter note, whatever the future holds for Shazam, this was the version that got me really into the character. I'll always be thankful for that. But seriously, Dwayne Johnson.